A final little bonus lecture on punctuating a form of writing that's very common and very useful in business writing, and that's bullet points. Now, as ever, different style guides recommend different approaches. So your first port of call should be to check what your organisation's chosen style guide has to say about bullet points, whether that's an in-house guide or a published guide like the Chicago Manual of Style. If you don't have a style guide to refer to, or if your style guide is silent on the question of bullet points, here are the general things that people tend to recommend. First of all, introduce your bulleted list with a colon. And by the way, there's no need to include a dash with it too. In the words of R.L. Trask, author of The Penguin Guide to Punctuation, a colon is never, 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 all in bold, followed by a hyphen or dash, in spite of what you might have been taught at school. Then, if your bulleted list contains fragments, in other words, if they're not whole sentences, I'd ditch the punctuation altogether. No need for full stops or commas or semicolons or anything like that after any of the listed items. Modern punctuation tends to keep things clean and simple. And notice too how each item starts with a lowercase letter. In contrast, if your bulleted list is made up of full sentences like this one, then start with an uppercase letter and use a full stop at the end of each item, just as you would with a normal sentence. Sometimes the items in your bulleted list might continue the sentence that began when you introduced the list, as here, the merger with Sino widget will allow us to diversify our products, etc. In this case, most guidelines recommend separating the listed items with a semicolon. Again, notice that because the bulleted list is effectively a single sentence broken up line by line, each item in the list starts with a lower case. Notice too that the penultimate item requires an and to ensure the text makes sense as a complete sentence. And to finish the sentence, the final bullet point ends with a full stop. Now you may have also noticed that the use of the colon in bullet points breaks the usual rule we saw in an earlier lecture that a colon should follow a full sentence. For example, the merger with Sino widget will allow us to is not a complete sentence. Overall, I find this approach with all these semicolons rather old-fashioned. I much prefer shorter, sharper bullet points with minimal punctuation like the first example we saw. It looks cleaner and more scannable to me, which is the whole point of bullet points. Oh, and one final tip for effective bullet points that's not so much about punctuation but is really important. Make sure your listed items are consistent. For example, the items in this list are all consistent because each one is a noun or thing word. Diversification, financing, risk, and so on. What you want to avoid is bullet points like this, where the listed items aren't consistent in this way. For example, the first bullet point uses a verb or action word, diversify, while the second bullet point uses a noun phrase, access to international financing. The other bullet points are similarly inconsistent. This kind of inconsistency is distracting and potentially confusing for readers, so it's definitely best avoided. So to sum up, for effective bullet points, keep them clear, consistent and simple. Ideally, keep them short too and with minimal punctuation.